Yeah, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for attending. It's nice to see so many trustees. Um, I always start with thank you for being a trustee. If it wasn't for you, public libraries could not exist in Michigan. So I know that job comes under the no good deed goes unpunished category, but thank you so much for being willing to serve your communities in this way. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share the slides and turn it over to Karen.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Um, Claire works with you guys a lot as library law specialist and provides trustee support. I am our federal programs manager, and I deal directly with libraries in terms of administrative training and subgrants. So, as part of that, policies come up a lot with finance. They come up a lot with Claire. So, we had the idea that a financial policies presentation would be a good one. So what we're going to do is review public library financial policies, various aspects of that, especially as it relates to library trustees. So you've got our contact information at the top. If you've got questions about any of the topics later, feel free to reach out to us. So what we're going to cover is not legal advice. Claire has our correct comment on the presentation, but we can offer information and resources. Sometimes we might have to say, and at this point, you might want to talk to a lawyer, and occasionally with this issue, you might want to talk to an accountant. But with that said, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about trustee duties with respect to library funding. We're going to talk about the various levels of funding you can get, federal versus state. We're going to talk about some library funding resources. A lot of this is very specific to Michigan. And we're also going to talk about how this impacts grant funding. So why this topic? Public libraries are government entities. We're accountable for our public funds in the same manner as other public entities. Um, we want to do the best we can for our community. We want to be fiscally responsible for the services that we provide. And it's also a legal requirement. We don't want to harm our community and our library by not following the law appropriately. And that said, the financial relationship with your municipalities, if you are indeed under a municipality, can be unclear or sometimes, as Claire has put it, unorthodox. So sometimes it's hard at first glance to determine what is the appropriate process or the appropriate law to follow. Libraries are government entities, but we don't always operate like other entities. It is interesting to be part of a research library that's open to the public in the state, and state facilities doesn't really understand that we're open to the public. So we feel your pain in when what you need to do doesn't really quite match what you understand of government entities. And finally, public library managers and boards are often not trained in financial practices. Um, one of my truisms for the library profession is one of our strengths for both trustees and library staff is we promote from within. We attract people who are interested in the idea of library services for their community. So we tend not to hire or have access to on our boards to CPAs and lawyers and people with the kind of expertise that might come in from a public administration degree. So the Library of Michigan staff try our best to fill in the gaps a little bit, but it's frequently an area where some more support is helpful. So hopefully this presentation will provide some of that.
Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about are what are the financial duties specifically of you as a trustee? Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the establishment of your particular library has an impact here. So as a trustee, you should absolutely know the establishment of your library. And that means whether you're, beyond just the fact you're a city or a township or a district, you should know the establishing act that you were created under. So if you are a city or a township or a village library, you should know what part of PA 164 you were established under, or maybe you're a charter township library. Maybe you are a home rule city library, in which case, you may be an advisory board and not a governing board, because there are different legal duties between governing boards and advisory boards. Most of what we're going to be talking about today are under governing boards. Um, and like Karen said, public libraries are kind of unique in that often, as the mission comes first, right? We're all want to make sure everybody has access to library services and want to make sure that kids have access to, books and reading, and that our community has access to the services that we provide. And the back end of it, in terms of the money, we all want money, we all need money, but we're not always as concerned about how the money is used, right? How does the money get there? Who's keeping an eye on the money? In terms of, like, you may be keeping your eye on the money in terms of balances and expenditures, but are you keeping an eye on, who is actually touching that money? What are the financial policies that may be being followed, and are they accurate? What are your internal controls? Um, do you read your audit every year? Things like that. What we're talking about today are more those nitty gritties that are important. So the number one duty of a trustee is really to steward the library and its assets. Um, your job, and this is why it's called a trustee, is because you're entrusted with this institution, right? You're entrusted with this very honored and valuable institution in your community, and your job is to keep that institution thriving and to keep its assets safe and growing, so that you can pass that institution healthy and vibrant onto the next group of trustees, and they would keep it going so that your community continues to have a thriving library throughout the years. And trustees before you did that and passed it on to you. Um, Part of that is that the number one thing that you keep your eye on is the money, right? Your job as that stewardship is to make sure that the library is funded and that the library is budgeted, so that the directors and staff can make sure that they're able to provide the services and meet the goals and the mission of the institution as you, the board, lay it out. Because as the board, if you are a governing board, you are entrusted with the strategic plan, with the vision and the mission of the library, with setting all of those things. And nothing's going to happen if you set a vision and expectations that are beyond what your library can afford and are beyond what your current staff can do. So it's all connected. In order for your staff to be able to provide the services that you as a board envision for your community and that your community may expect, you need to have the money in order to do that and the assets to do that. And not only getting the money, but you have to be able to maintain and grow that money. So then that also gets into the management of the assets that you are able to get. So you make sure that they are invested, that they're cultivated, and that they're expended in a manner that's appropriate, that's legal, that matches with, again, your outlook, your strategic plan, your vision for the library. But also, part of entrusting and stewarding that library is maintaining one of your most important assets, which is your staff. And that's making sure that your staff is adequately paid and provided with appropriate and adequate benefits. Because you want to encourage your staff to stay, right? You spend all of this time and money training them and fostering them. So when you cultivate really good staff, it's better for the library if you can keep that staff. So it's also an asset that has to be maintained. And part of that is also having the money in order to have offer them the appropriate, benefits and compensation that would encourage them to stay. And the same is true with your facilities, right? Preserving your facilities. Some of you may be in older buildings. Some of you may be building new buildings. Um, all of that also requires money, right? So it's not only do you have to maintain your staff and the books and the subscriptions and all of that, the technology, but you also have to preserve the actual physical building. Um, Lastly, all of this involves oversight of financial procedures, as we mentioned. Many of you may subcontract, so to speak, the actual financial processes to your municipality. Depending on your establishment, the law may state that your funds, if you're a PA 164 township or city or village library, the law specifies that your funds have to sit in your municipal treasury in a separate fund called the library fund. Um, but the municipality's job is to simply hold that money and disperse it. It is not the municipality's job to do anything else with that money. They have no authority over that money. All of the authority lies in your lap. And that's what the statute says. Now, how much authority and how much um, you delegate to the municipality to do your accounting, like if they do your payroll or if they do, your invoices and stuff, that's okay. But one of the things the board would want to ensure is that you have a written agreement between you and your municipality that lays out this is what we, the board, are delegating to you. This is what we expect. We expect that you're following appropriate financial procedures according to GASB or, things we're going to discuss. We're expecting that you give us regular reports on what's occurring with our money. And, anything else that you feel is important to note. That just simply means that everybody involved understands what the expectations and understandings of everybody else are. So that's strongly, strongly encouraged. I know that it's very common that some municipalities like to, shall we say, assume they have more authority over your money than they really do. And if that becomes an issue, then that is a time to get your attorney involved. And we are going to be speaking about attorneys also. Um, Oversight of financial procedures and policies becomes very important. It's becoming very important, especially more recently. Because those also include safeguards that are in effect to prevent everything from fraud, misuse of funds, cyber theft, cyber security. All of that can be wrapped up into your financial policies and procedures. You have some policies and procedures that are required by law, and you have other ones that are best practices and are prudent. Okay. Um, I'm going to actually let Karen talk about federal versus state versus local versus regulations.
All righty. The exciting topics that we bring up.
Mhm.
So one of the things to consider when you're using funds is where did the funds come from? Um, we'll go into this in more detail, but what rules apply to your funds? Is it just your local policies? Well, no. State laws are going to apply to public library funds in Michigan, but you're also going to have to be aware of federal laws. If you have local laws or regulation, for example, if you pay for staff travel to conferences for professional development, what are your municipality's rules for travel reimbursements? What rates are allowed, that sort of thing. Um, in specific, though, if you are getting funding for federal, state, or local programs or grants, you're going to have to look at whatever legislation and regulation applies to that additional funds. So let's look at that in a little more detail. Um, in an extreme nutshell, federal program funds are governed by federal laws and federal regulation. So if your library staff apply to the Library of Michigan for one of our LSTA grants, that is federal funds. We are a state agency, but we're dispersing federal funds. They stay federal funds when we give them out as grants, and when we give them to you to use for your program, they are still federal funds. So um, as they go through down through the levels, they don't lose their original appropriation. So for our LSTA funds, when we're using it and when a grantee is using it, we are looking at IMLS's authorizing legislation. That's the Museum and Library Services Act of 2008. We are also looking at the annual appropriations bill for IMLS. And finally, there is federal regulations that relate to grant administration, that's us, and use of grant funds. If we do a subgrant, that's you. If you ever do get one of these grants, I will talk to you at length about that. So no worries about looking it up right now. State program funds are governed by state laws and regulations. You're familiar with this in terms of state aid for public libraries. You may get a state grant. If you're lucky, perhaps you'll get a direct appropriation from the state legislature. And then locally, with your municipal funds, you are going to be covered by local ordinances and your policies, but you're also going to be covered by state laws because you are a state municipal organization. So just remember that whoever appropriates the money, the feds, the state, or local, you're going to need to keep track of the rules at each level. So what's the catch when you get these funds? Basically keeping track of all of those rules. We've got the note here that in addition to state and federal financing laws, you also need to follow applicable laws and regulations pertaining to the originating program. So for us, for IMLS, we're going to follow the General Code of Federal Regulations for administering grant funds as a pass-through entity. That's what they call a state agency when we distribute federal funds down to local governments. We're a pass-through entity. We follow those overall rules, but we follow them in light of what IMLS says in both their regulations into CFR and their authorizing legislation, that Museum and Library Services Act of 2008. So our bullet point addition here is you may not disregard the authorizing or program legislation and regulations and only follow local policies and procedures. You can apply local policies to state and federal funds, but only if they are more restrictive. So if you pay someone who travels to a conference a lower mileage rate, you can do that. But if you want to pay them a higher mileage rate than the federal government allows and you're using federal funds, you may not do that. So if your policies are more restrictive, you can follow them. If they are less restrictive, you can't essentially roll back the state or federal rules applying to that money. So you may
Right.
want to consider consulting an attorney, though, if the federal or state laws conflict with program regulations as you understand them. One area that's a lot of confusion for libraries is how to implement the Children's Internet Protection Act locally. And that's one where, there used to be quite a bit more angst than there is now, but that was difficult to understand how that applied in local circumstances. So if you're in a situation like that, it's always good to consult with your attorney.
And one good example of this, what Karen was just talking about, is both under state aid and penal fines. So state aid is a state program, right? That's a state program, a state appropriation. Um, Part of the State Aid Act states that state aid money can only be used for the library, right? And the same with penal fines. Penal fines can only be used for the library. So your municipality cannot take any of your penal fines for any reason. They cannot take any of your state aid for any reason. Those funds are specifically earmarked towards, library usage. So that's an example of, state regulation for a state program that governs that uh, program and is different than the general finance laws.
Okay. The last thing here on federal, state, local, you're like, okay, which one do I follow? There's all these rules. And essentially, you really need to read the grant and program documentation. Your program officer, if you're getting this through a grant, will be glad to help. If it's me, I am glad to have a meeting and talk with you. But you will get some of that somewhat legalese, bureaucratic jargon documents. It is important to review them and make sure you understand how you can use the funds. And at that point, you follow the order of precedence. If it's federal funds, you're going to start with US code. If it's state or local funds that US code might apply to, you're going to start with US code. The first thing you're going to follow under that is the authorizing legislation of the agency and their Appropriations Act, like I mentioned, we do with IMLS. Then you're going to follow cross-cutting legislation that applies across agencies. And an example of this would be the Children's Internet Protection Act. That wasn't legislation that IMLS had. It was legislation for the entire federal government. So all agencies that provided funds for internet access had to follow the SIPA Act as well as their authorizing legislation.
So if you use E-rate, if you get E-rate, part of the E-rate program, SIPA is a part of that.
Yes, you have to follow SIPA across all federal funding. So the next step is federal regulations, and that is the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. If you are getting grant funds directly from a federal agency or from a state agency as a pass-through entity like the Library of Michigan, you're going to end up following the rules that are in 2 CFR 200. A lot of that, if you get a grant from us, will be written into your grant administration manual, and we're always available to help. And individual agencies have their own regulations as well. IMLSs are very limited, which is very nice to all of us, but some agencies have quite a bit of additional regulation that essentially explains how they're implementing the law that authorizes them. The third thing you come down to is state laws. Then you go into state regulations. Then you do your local ordinances. And then you do your local policies. So that is your order of precedence. You follow number one first, number two second, number three third, etc. on down. And like I said, you're absolutely welcome to apply local policies, but only if they're more restrictive.
Okay. So what we're talking about here are you, so as part of your library funding, you have funding that is your constant funding. Um, And some of that funding is what we were just talking about as program funding. So, some of that may be state aid, some of it may be penal fines, some of it may be grants that your library directors apply for through Karen, which is the federal IMLS programs. Some of it may be things like E-rate, which is a federal program. So it gets a little complicated when we talk about, managing program funds that have specific regulations, and we are talking about some of these other general finance practices that involve a lot of your money. So we're going to talk a little bit about general financial practices, right? So this is the bulk of your public funds. Um, so as government entities using public funds, now we say, what are public funds? Well, public funds legally, your public funds is any dollar that hits your bank account. Since you are a public entity, all of your money is public funds. If you receive donations from your friends group, even though your friends group is not a government entity, they're a nonprofit corporation, and they solicit and get funds directly from people. So ostensibly, they're not public funds. The minute they hit your bank account, they are now public funds. So there's not a lot of splitting of hairs when you start thinking about, well, when we're talking about public funds, what's not public funds? For you, pretty much everything is public funds. Now, the Michigan Constitution is the Bible, so to speak, when it comes to talking about the management of public funds in Michigan. Our Constitution is pretty comprehensive about the do's and don'ts of public funds and what the priorities are. And then it delegates the legislature to create legislation to get into the nitty-gritty of how do you now comply with the Constitution. And then different state agencies can also create regulations, which then tell you how to comply with the statutes, with the legislation. So some of the things, these are not all of the statutes you have to know about because, I didn't want to get into the weeds of just a list of statutes, but this is just representative. Um, so the Government Accounting Systems Board, or GASB, is not a statute, but GASB is an organization that has it's pretty much accepted as the authority in managing public funds, right? Its kind of sister or brother group is what's called FASB, right? Financial Accounting Standards Board. FASB is what is uh, adhered to by Fortune 500 companies and the private sector, right? So you have FASB and you have GASB. We are interested in GASB. So all of the laws we're going to talk to you about and all of your accounting procedures, all of your financial policies, will want to take GASB into account. And a lot of times it's built into a lot of stuff. But they have an excellent website that answers a lot of questions. You have the Uniform Budgeting and Accounting Act, which is the act that tells you have to use the chart of accounts, right? Municipalities in Michigan all have to have their accounting and their budgeting done through a chart of accounts method. So that's the way your municipality has to keep track of their accounts. It's the way that the library's accounts also have to be taken care of. Now, can your municipality include the library within their chart of accounts? They can, but again, you want to make sure that you have an understanding with your municipality because a lot of times the authorities can get a little bit gray. And it's important to know that you, as a board, if you are a governing board, you have complete control over your money. Now, that is dependent on your, again, your Establishment Act. So, for example, if you are a PA 164 city, village, or township library, you have complete control over your money, budgeting, expenditures, everything. If you're a county library, you have control over your budget um, to the extent that you can change your budget without approval of the city council. But the city council levies your millage. So as far as how much millage gets levied, sometimes that's in the lap of your county commission rather. So there can be some slight differences, but generally, as a rule, if you're a governing board, you have enormous amounts of authority over your money. And you may not realize this, right? It may be that your municipality is telling you one thing, but your establishment law is telling you something else. So it's important that you understand your power under your establishment law. And that's why we encourage you to know it and review it. And if you have questions, you can contact me, you can contact your attorney. Um, Budget hearings of local governments pretty much says that whenever you do your budget, you have to have a public hearing before your budget's approved so that members of the public can comment on your budget. Same is true of your municipality. Sometimes your municipality may include the library budget in their budget hearing. That's okay. Again, it's one of those things that, it's part of your agreement with your municipality. Um, Depositories for public monies. This tells you where can you put your money. So where can the municipality put your money, right? It lays out what kinds of financial institutions can hold public money. Credit card transactions. It may interest you to know that if you are a PA 164 municipal library, or if you're anything but a district library, you can only have a credit card if you go through your municipality to get one. You cannot independently get a credit card for your library because the law doesn't recognize that libraries can do that. So you have to kind of work with your municipality to get a credit card through them. Um, the investment of surplus funds of political subdivisions. This covers your investments. So if you have a fund balance at the end of the year and you have extra, money that you want to invest to kind of grow for your library, or maybe you want to have a capital fund because you're considering renovations or a new building, you can invest that money. But there are pretty strict rules regarding how you can invest it, right? The big no-no is you can't invest in the stock market. You can't invest in what they call risky, right? So you can't invest it like you might invest your own personal money. There are certain rules, and there's lots of financial advisors that work specifically with government entities who can offer you guidance on that front, like how to get the most out of your money. And then there's a whole lot of other laws involving public funds. We'll get into a little bit more of that in a bit. Um, so just some basic facts on library financial practices. We mentioned if you're a governing board, you most likely have financial control over your budgets and expenditures, no matter what your municipality says. All of you in your library should have separate funds. Your library fund should be in a separate account. They should not be commingled with the municipal funds, no matter what the municipality says. There is a kind of tiny little mention in the Treasury's explanation of the Uniform Chart of Accounts that says that public library funds can be put in a pooled investment account, but the municipality cannot do that without talking to the board first, right? You have to give permission for that. They can't automatically take your funds and put them in a pooled investment account with their funds unless you authorize it. They may try, but they can't. Library boards, as well as your municipal treasurer and other officers who work with funds, have a fiduciary duty. So your fiduciary duty and pretty much says that you have to act in the best interests of the library at all times, not in the best interests of your municipality. I don't care who appointed you. I don't care, what they said you had to do. Your fiduciary duty, which is a very serious legal duty, says that you have to act in the best interest of the library at all times. Not in the best interest of your city, your municipality, not even in the best interest, specifically speaking, of your community, of the library staff. It is in what is the best interest of the library as an institution. Because remember, your job is to safeguard that institution and preserve it and make sure that it flourishes and provides service for your community through the ages. You don't want to be the library board that ends the library, right? All of you should have very good knowledge of your budget and very good knowledge of your finances. You should know exactly where all the library's money is. You should know exactly how the library funds can be spent. Now, I'm not talking about micromanaging your director. Some of this depends on how you've allocated library responsibilities to your director. But in the end, it is the board that is going to be responsible. The buck stops at the board. If there is a question about your financial practices, if there is an auditing issue, if someone sues you, it is going to be the board's name on the lawsuit. It's going to be the board's name on the letter from the Department of Treasury. It is not going to be your director's name. So it is your responsibility to make sure that you're getting regular financial reports from your director, from your municipality, that shows here's the library's money, here's where that money is right now, here's how much of your budget is encumbered, here's how much of your budget is left to spend. Here are, you should know that whoever is taking care of your money is following accurate financial procedures and policies. And if you need to ask them to see them, then you have every right to look at them. And hopefully you had a hand in approving them. But if your municipality manages largely your money, you absolutely should ask them for a copy of their financial policies. Because again, unless you have a signed agreement with your municipality the fact that they screw up is still going to end up in your lap because you are the name on the door. You're the government entity with responsibility. Um, as we said, all monies that go to a public library are public monies. Your establishment law is your key to how much authority and responsibility you have. Um, the Constitution is where most of the requirements and restrictions on public money come from. Um, the fact that your municipality, because I hear this all the time, a library will ask me a question. Um, so can the library buy staff lunch? And I have to say, no, they cannot. It's a violation of the public purpose doctrine, which is tied to the Constitution in Michigan. And they say, oh, but our municipality does it all the time. Well, I don't care. It's still a violation of the Constitution. You cannot do that. So if you're going to continue to do it, I recommend that you talk to your attorney. So just because your municipality does something doesn't mean that's okay. One of the things Karen and I do is we review audits from all over the state. And you would be surprised to see some of the audit letters and comments we see from various municipalities throughout the state on how badly they manage their money. So just because your municipality does it doesn't mean it's okay. Check with your attorney or your accountant or your auditor if you have a serious question. Um, just if you're doing something wrong, your auditor will not always catch it, right? Your auditor, their job is not to find the needle in the haystack. They're not going to go through every single thing and tell you you're doing everything, whatever you're doing wrong. They're going to look at certain things. And if they see a pattern or if they see a deviation, they will alert you to it, but they're not going to catch everything. So don't assume just because your auditor didn't catch things that absolutely everything is okay. This is really one of those things where you do the smell test, right? If something comes across your desk or across your meeting and you think, huh, that doesn't quite seem right, then you should probe that question. You should ask that question of your auditor, ask it of your director, ask it. You can call me, you can call Karen, say, hey, is this okay? That's perfectly fine. People do it all the time. Um, it's not a problem till it's a problem. That's kind of a theme here at the Library of Michigan. There's lots of incidents where, libraries are like, oh, you know what? We've never had a problem with that. Well, it's one of those things where it isn't a problem until all of a sudden you have a member of the community that for whatever reason is not happy with the library. And that's happening a lot more lately. And low-hanging fruit are finances. One way for people to get at the library and to get at library board members and to get at municipalities is to poke at them through financials. Because as I said, as we mentioned at the beginning, most library boards and most elected government officials are not are not accountants, are not auditors, and just don't know. And so they mean well. It's not that anybody's trying to do anything wrong, but sometimes they just make a mistake or they make an incorrect judgment and don't double check. And so they're doing something wrong. And then someone finds out, and before you know it, you're on the front page of your local newspaper that, this much money has been given to the library and something's not being done correctly. So again, the smell test, right? If something shows up and you think, or you see something on a report and you think, oh, you know what, this just doesn't look bad, don't assume that you're wrong. Just ask the question. Always ask. There's nothing wrong with asking the question. Um, we have a public library financial management guide that actually Karen puts together that is amazing. It is done in part by the accountants at Yao and Yao, which are a big financial accounting firm that works with government entities. Um, I strongly recommend that you take a look at it. We have it for free on our website. We also have hard copies at the Library of Michigan that we can send you if you shoot one of us an email. Um, and it gives you a really good overview of a lot of what we're going to talk to you about today, and gives you links to statutes and all kinds of things. So I strongly recommend that all of you take a look at this. It's not a hard read. It's not super thick, but it definitely will give you a decent grounding in a lot of these information. Karen, is there anything you want to add to the Public Library Financial?
There are some links on our final slide about that, but it does have a lot of, the overview of public library financial management. There are also some brief video presentations on the website that it's at, where Alan Panter from Yao and Yao went through some of the common questions that we get and explain those in a little more detail. The videos aren't new, but the information is still accurate. You might want to take a look at those.
Um, so we're going to quickly go through just an overview on how are your libraries funded? What are the typical funding mechanisms for public libraries? So the first one is what we call local support, which is also part of the state aid requirements. So local support is any money that emanates from your community. So your millages, your appropriations, donations, fines, library fines, and those kinds of things, money that emanates directly from your municipality. Penal fines, right, are considered local support because they come from your county. Penal fines are not municipal monies. Penal fines are county funds that are allocated from courts to the county for the express purpose of funding library service. The only thing your municipalities can do with penal fines is give them to libraries for service. And penal fines, you do not have to give service to a municipality only for penal fines. But that's a whole other presentation. State aid. State aid is a state appropriation program. There are certain eligibility guidelines that govern this. Again, that's something that we can go into in a different presentation, but there are links on the Library of Michigan website under state aid that provide information on all of those. Right now, this lists the 2020 account, but right now we're over 15 million with state aid, and this year we got an extra million. So for 2024-25, it will be over 16 million of funds that will be given out to public libraries based on a per capita amount um, on their service area, so the number of people you serve. Grants, and I'm going to turn this over to Karen.
So not everyone has grants every year or from some of the entities that we've listed here, but essentially you can get a grant from a private or public entity. You can apply for a federal grant. You can apply for a state grant. I recommend looking at the Michigan Arts and Cultural Council for state grants. You can get one from your local government. You can also get one from a community or family or business foundation. But one of the things that you're going to see with all of these is it's unusual to see grants given for general operating expenses or capital expenditures, but they tend to be for programming to support the priorities of the grant funder. For example, I keep referencing back to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for the funds that we receive. One of their priorities is to make sure underserved populations, people with disabilities, for example, have access to library services. So that's one thing they like to see in grant proposals is how are you going to improve or provide services to patrons in your communities with disabilities? They are less interested in seeing, well, we're really having difficulty with our budget this year. Can you fund our staff? So sometimes funding your staff is doing a program that supports their priorities. But just keep in mind when you're talking to the funder that your best bet is to explain how you can help them serve the populations that they are interested in helping. I've told people in grant presentations, they're not in the business of giving out money, even though that's what it looks like. They're in the business of partnering with you to serve a particular population, to help a particular group of people. And when you talk to grant funders in that way and manage the funds with that idea, it makes it much easier to make that connection with both applying and managing the funds. Grant funds typically are things that you apply for. You don't get them as a matter of course, like revenue. They have an expenditure period, meaning you're going to see a contract of some form or another. We issue what we call a grant award notice, and it says this is the start date of your grant period. This is the end date of your grant period. And specifically in that grant period, this is the first day you can buy things, and this is the last day you can buy things. I do mention that because at least with our funds, we can't pay for something that you bought before that first day or after that last date. And we don't ever want to tell you that we can't pay for something. There are generally reporting requirements, and the funds need to be used for the approved grant application activities. So if a grant funder reaches out to you and says, we loved your application, this looks great, we've approved your grant, what you can spend the money for are the things that you described in that proposal. If something happens, I call this real life, when real life happens and you can't do it quite the way you said in the proposal, do reach out to the grant funder and get permission to change it. If you get permission to change it, you can then use the funds for a slightly different program, a slightly different purpose. If you do not have permission to change it, you're restricted to using those funds for what you listed in the application. And funds are typically provided through a contract. A small local foundation might be a little more relaxed about how they issue funds. If you're getting it from a larger community or business foundation or from a federal agency or state agency, you will have a contract that will reference the various legislation that you need to look to.
Okay, some other sources of money for your library are personal property tax reimbursements through the Local Community Stabilization Authority Act. This is essentially reimbursing libraries for the repeal of the business tax. And this is calculated by Treasury, and it is dispersed by the Local Community Stabilization Authority. So it's two entities that work together. Your directors have been, versed on this. Typically, if you have a question about how much you receive, you would contact Treasury. If you have a question about why aren't I getting my money, you would contact the Local Community Stabilization Authority. For libraries that are municipal libraries, so your, village, city, township library, your money is often bundled in with the municipality's money because any municipalities, any millage holder gets these funds. So schools, fire department, everybody gets it. Your municipality also gets PPT funds. So the library's PPT funds will be combined with your municipalities. And usually what happens is the local community stabilization authority sends the payment and it's itemized. This much is for the municipality, this much is for your library, this much is for your, school, this much, it'll, or your fire department, your police department. So you would want to, it's one of those things that should show up on reports your municipality gives you. If it doesn't, then it would be worth asking about because you definitely want to make sure you're getting those money. There are a few municipalities that may not be getting it, or a few libraries that may not be getting it, simply because your particular municipality is no longer suffering a loss from the loss of the business tax. So it could be that you got a new big box store or other things that can mitigate some of those losses. TIFA, Recodified Tax Increment Financing Act. This is the act that if you have, so over quite a bit of money, over 15, I think the last time I looked, it was between maybe $5 and $10 million annually are captured by from public libraries by DDAs and other authorities. This law provides a way that public libraries can exempt them so their millages from capture. It is dependent on a few different factors, but if you have a millage that has passed after January of 2017, your millage is exempt from capture, period. If you're a city library, it is also exempt from capture. There are some other requirements for city libraries, but the fact remains, if you have a millage, whether it's a renewal or whether it's a new millage passed after January 1st, 2017, that millage is exempt from capture. So if it is being captured, it should not be captured. And if it is being captured, that's something you want to talk to your attorney about. Because it can be a lot of money, because sometimes it's multiple authorities are capturing. So it's not just your DDA, but it's also, it's not just a DDA, but it's also a corridor authority. It's, multiple. Fundraising. You can fundraise as a government entity. You are a nonprofit. You are a tax exempt entity, whether you are a 501c3 or not. Public libraries can become 501c3s. The main reason to do so, really, for a public library is that if you anticipate fundraising or requesting grants in very large amounts, or you want to work with large foundations or grant making entities, because a lot of them require a 501c3 designation. And a lot of times that's because for the entity who is giving out a lot of grants, if you're the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or you're one of these very big foundations, you have a lot of people who want grants. You have thousands of people who want grants. So when you're processing those grants, it's easier if you say, look, we're only going to accept ones that are 501c3s, because then you don't have to verify that the people applying are nonprofits. It's already a thing. Even though as a government entity, you are a nonprofit tax exempt entity. So being a 501c3 automatically tells the foundation you're a tax exempt nonprofit. Um, so if you want to get grants from them, it's a good thing to be a 501c3. If you're not expecting to do that, then you don't really have to be a 501c3, because already your tax exempt designation um, enables people who donate to you to take a deduction on their taxes if they can. Michigan no longer has the ability to deduct from your taxes um, for a donation to a charitable entity. Uh, they're slowly bringing back some. They just recently brought back, if you donate to a university's sports team, you can get a donation, you can get an exemption. But if you donate to a public library, you don't get a deduction on your taxes. Federally, when the tax code was changed in like 2016-18, it changed to a large personal deduction. So a lot of people use that like 25 grand, 24 grand personal deduction rather than itemizes. If you itemize, you would be able to deduct a library donation from your taxes, but a lot of people just don't, because very few people give more than $25,000 in donations. Um, if you want to fundraise, if you have friends of the library, they're a separate nonprofit corporation. They do not come under the umbrella of the library. They are not governed by the library. They don't answer to the library. They are a completely separate entity. The money they raise is their money, which is why you want to have an agreement with your friends group to discuss things like who decides how the money's spent, how much money can be spent on actual fundraising activities, like spending money to make money. Um, uh, the library board member should not be on the board of the friends group. That's a conflict of interest. You don't want to be on the board of the entity receiving the money and also on the board of the entity giving the money. That is not a good look. You can be a member of the Friends, but you don't want to be a decision maker on the Friends. If you want to self fundraise, you can do that, whether you're a 501c3 or not. You cannot fundraise for political reasons, including your own millage. You have to adhere to the Charitable Organizations and Solicitations Act, which governs fundraising in this state. There are certain record keeping and accounting requirements. And if you bring in money as a result of fundraising, those funds have to be kept in a certain way. And there are rules regarding privacy of donors and all sorts of other things on top of the regular management of funds for libraries. Karen, is there anything you'd like to add on to that?
I don't think I have anything right now.
Okay. The Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act is the act that dictates how you handle those funds you receive from fundraising. Gift acceptance policies. These are policies that tell people, here are the kinds of things we take. We'll take money. We will not take stock because public libraries are not allowed to own stock. If you receive stock as part of like a bequest, you have to sell it immediately. You might not want to take real estate. You might not want to take buildings. You might not want to take works of art because all of these things can be difficult to liquidate into money. So you might want to put some thought into exactly what kind of donations will we take and what kind of donations do we not want to take. And that is totally up to you as an entity. Okay, spending public funds. We already know everything in the accounts public funds. Essentially, this is the public purpose doctrine. So under the state constitution, there is a provision that says the state credit cannot be shared with any individual or for the benefit of any individual. It is only for the public. That is the public purpose doctrine, and that Michigan has adopted the public purpose doctrine as the guiding principle of how public funds are spent. So what that means is that in order to spend public funds, the purpose must be a public purpose. It must be for the benefit of the public. So operations of your library, fine. Paying library staff, fine. Library staff benefits, fine.
Mhm.
Um, Making sure you build a new building, fine. Anything that preserves the library and encourages the operations of the library, fine. Um, Programming, fine. Summer reading, fine. Summer reading giveaways, fine. What's not fine? Coffee for the staff, coffee for boards, dinner for board before their board meeting, giving gift cards to staff at Christmas. Anything that results in individuals that the general public does not have access to is a problem. If you put coffee pot in the public area of the library and you say anyone can have a cup of coffee, guess what? Your staff can have coffee too, and that's perfectly fine. But you put coffee in the staff break room, that is not okay. So some of this gets a little weird. So it's one of those things that, again, if there's something you want to do and you're not sure, you're better to ask. You want to give your staff a bonus at Christmas time? You can do that, but it has to be in your budget under compensation. It can't be a surprise bonus. It has to be something planned for. Karen, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was thinking in specific, you may run into this issue with particular grant funds. Um, there's a couple of items that are almost never allowable for federal grants, one of which is alcohol, meaning alcoholic beverages. Another is food, except in very limited circumstances. We get a lot of requests for, I want to do a small summer reading grant and I want to buy pizza for the teens. And the pizza for the teens needs to be local funds, even though it is a program for the public. Um, Another thing is lobbying. Anytime you're working with federal funds, you may not use the federal funds for lobbying, even if it directly relates to the project you're doing.
You can't do it with state funds either. Um, and as far as buying food for teens, you could probably get away with that as long as it's part of a program and every teen has the availability to do it. So you open up your program to any teen who walks in the door, as long as the public has access to that program, you should be able to. Now, there are some communities, I've run into some local treasurers that push back at me against that, but I have a memo all drafted with legal citations and everything. You can talk to your attorney. I am happy to give you this and you can pass it on to your attorney or your treasurer. As long as the public have access to it. There's even statements from the Department of Treasury that gives the example of the coffee. If everybody has access to it, it's allowable. Just because it's food is not the problem. The problem is the beneficiary of the purchase. It's not what the purchase is. That is the issue.
In
Go ahead,
Claire,
Karen.
just to jump in a little bit with the grants aspect of it, if you're listening to us and you're thinking, well, what do I do if I really do need to spend this with grants and I don't have these funds locally? Um, what you can do, and I frequently talk library staff members who are applying through this, is ask me, ask other grant program people. These are my overall expenses for this program. If I can't use your grant funds for this, are there other expenditures we're incurring that are allowable? And see if you can modify your budget so that you have the full um, benefit of the grant without spending any of the funds on something that your funder wouldn't allow.
Mhm.
And I frequently have no issues working through that with library staff because they're used to thinking, well, I have money for this, so I don't have to ask for it. And they kind of put that off, it's out of their scope. They're not really thinking about it when they apply for the grant. And when I talk to them, they're like, oh, well, we're going to buy this. I'm like, wait, I can pay for that.
Mhm.
So we shift things around so that you can use local funds for something that the grant program can't cover.
And also work with your friends group. You can also ask for you can fundraise for some of these things that you can't pay for, like staff recognition. If you have a friends group that is a 501c3, depending on the basis under which they were declared a 501c3, many are public charities. If they are a public charity, they also have a public purpose restriction. But there are circumstances under which your friends group, as a separate nonprofit, um, may have the ability to designate funds for things that you as a government entity do not. So that's something to work with your friends group on. Um, and lastly, make sure that you have those financial policies in control. So everybody, including your director, including other uh, members of staff who are in charge of expending money, understand what's permitted and what's not. Lastly, we talk about, we are, make sure policies are crucial, right? You want to make sure your financial policies are adequate, that they are legal, and that they are going to serve you well and not get you into trouble. Um, be cautious of just copying policies from other libraries, and this would be any policy, not just your financial policy. The problem is that in Michigan, all of these different establishment types come with different rules and restrictions. So one is not always the same as another. So you can look at someone else's policy to get an idea of how you might do things, but you're going to want to make sure that you draft your own policy and get your attorney to review it, that you don't just blindly copy another's and just put it into, implement it. Um, you're not alone. There are lots of people to help you. Make sure that hire an attorney and get to know a financial professional, preferably one that works with government entities. Um, I have a list of attorneys who are specifically library law attorneys. Library law is a subset of municipal law. Not every municipal attorney knows about library law. So your county attorney, your city attorney, your township attorney, odds are they don't know a lot about library law. Also, if you're a public library, for purposes most of the time, for purpose of your finances, you're fairly autonomous. Your municipal attorney, their client is your municipality. So whenever they work with you, they're always going to have in their mind what is best for the municipality, not what is best for you as the library. And if you have an issue with your municipality, then they're always going to be on the side of the municipality. So you want to make sure you have an attorney who is only caring about you. And there are lots of really good library law attorneys in the state. A lot of them are very affordable and reasonable. And you don't have to have a retainer. You can just, as you need them, you call them and you pay for them. Um, and especially with policies and stuff, you can get pretty good deals. So I would strongly recommend that you at least get to know one. I do have a list, and I'm happy to send. If you shoot me an email, I'll send you a list. Um, Always make sure you get a report on your audit, even if your municipality is the one that does your audit, which is fine. But always ask for the auditor to also talk to the library board, or maybe you go to the meeting where the auditor is talking to the city council or the township board, so that you also hear the report. Always read your auditing report for the library. Make sure that it is what you you recognize it, that you're not like, hey, wait a minute. Um, Talk to us if we can help you with anything. look to your fellow board members, right? As a board, you work in a group, right? You are like this, and each of you are members of the board, but the board has to act as a group. None of you can act independently. So work with your board members if you have questions. Everybody has different talents and knowledge. Um, we have a financial cohort that your board member can, or not, I mean, I'm sorry, your library director can become a part of and receive a certificate in government finance. I'm going to let Karen mention that for a minute.
Yeah, we do this with the University of Georgia Carl Vincennes School of Government. One of their instructors is a former public library accountant, and she does a fantastic job going through 6 courses on public library financial management. It includes internal controls, policies like we're talking about today, governmental accounting standards, etc. Um, we did just finish ramping up our 3rd cohort yesterday. They had their graduation ceremony yesterday, and they do get a certificate for the course from the University of Georgia. We also do some work with cohort members directly, the Library of Michigan staff, on Michigan-specific topics. We are not doing it this fall and winter, but we will bring it back in 2025. So we will be posting that out for people to apply to. We do it at about 30 people at a time. So look for that next summer, or have your library director reach out to us.
The Michigan Municipal League has a ton of really good information on expenditures, especially the public purpose doctrine and a good explanation of that. The Michigan Department of Treasury has some really good local government resources and explanation, and so does Michigan State University Extension program. So I recommend any of these to look at if you have some additional questions or you want to do a little additional digging or do a little additional research. Um, I just noticed someone's asking about the attorney list. I'll tell you what, I'll send a copy of it to Becky, and Becky can include it on the email she's going to send all of you. So all of you will get a copy of it. And if you don't need it, you can just, delete it. But if you need it, you have it. Um, yes, I agree with Karen. The Fiscally Ready Communities program is really awesome. Um, and I think, Karen, are we over time or do we have
I thought it went till
2:30?
2:30.
Oh, okay. So that means we have a little bit of extra time. We have at the end of our slides, we have some the rest of the slides are pretty much just about policies. We kind of tacked them on to the end, thinking that, even though we're not talking specifically about policies right now, we'd give you the information so that you had it. So we will include those slides in the ones that we send you. I'm going to go ahead and unshare so that we can answer a couple questions. Um, I see that somebody asked about office equipment for board members for tracking finances. So if your treasurer takes a significant part or really works for the library in terms of looking at finances and tracking finances and doing the budget and kind of acting for the board in keeping track of all these financial things, then it would be a proper operational expense for the library to provide a laptop to that board member. However, that board member would have to return that laptop when their term was up. They couldn't keep it,
Mhm.
and they would pass it on to the next treasurer. So it would be the property of the library, but they're using it. So that would certainly be an appropriate. I do not think a printer at the home of the treasurer is an appropriate purchase, but I think a laptop is uh, is possible. But you know what? Every situation is different. A lot of it depends on exactly what that treasurer does.
Mhm.
Uh, so could there be scenarios where maybe a printer is appropriate? Yes. If there's an ADA thing involved, there is possibility. So a lot of it is depending on exactly what the situation is. But I would say a laptop is reasonable. Um, let's see, what do we have? Library can get a location's penal fines without providing service. No. The only way a library can get penal fines is so the way this works is libraries can contract with unserved populations. So municipalities that do not have a library or do not provide library service to their population, libraries can contract with that municipality, and part of the payment for services can be the penal fines. There should never be contracts that are only for penal fines, because as part of your fiduciary duty says, and part of the requirements for state funds and for public funds is that you cannot give away government services for free. You can't just give away government assets for free. So that means that if you're going to give service to another municipality, they have to pay fair market value. So they have to pay what it costs the library to provide the service. So part of their payment can certainly be their penal fines. But then most of the time, they're also going to have to pony up other money. The other issue is if your legal service area has a millage, and so your city or your township or your county are paying $50 to $100 a year in taxes or more for your library, and then you bring in this other township that are only paying penal fines. Well, penal fines are from the county, they're from the courts. Those taxpayers are paying nothing for the use of that library. So when you're going to go renew your millage and you have a member of the community saying, "Hey, I pay $100 a year, but my friend in the township next door pays nothing for, and we both get the same service." How did that happen? You don't want to be in that position because it really does create conflict in communities. It is right now in different communities, and it does. It also is a violation of your fiduciary duty. You should not be giving away library assets for free, and that includes services. So, um, so when you contract, part of it is definitely penal fines, but the Library of Michigan will not authorize the payment of penal fines unless we have proof that you are providing services to that community.
Mhm.
And that proof would be a contract between your library and that community. Um, and a lot of if it is an unserved area, so unserved areas receive penal fines, even though they don't have a library, the penal fines go in escrow. So they're getting the per capita amount for each of their population in escrow. So there are some unserved communities in parts of the state that have accrued a fair amount of penal fines. They may have thousands of dollars in penal fines. Um, and so any library that serves them will then receive all of that money. But also keep in mind that ongoing service is going to require more than one lump sum of penal fines. So yeah, there is no situation under which a library would get penal fines and not serve the community. Uh, let's see. I think there was someone asked about bequests. So if you receive a bequest, and I know that recently several libraries in the state have been fortunate enough to receive pretty large bequests, which is awesome. The two things about bequests are, one, if you have an opportunity, or if a member of a family asks you, "Hey, we would like to give you money in honor of our aunt or grandmother or whatever," or they want to leave you money in your will, you want to ask them to specifically leave the money to the library and be very clear about it, because there are many situations where they leave it to the municipality for the library, and that creates huge amounts of problems. We've had municipalities divert it to park programs, municipalities just keep the money, or municipalities who put it away for the library but then demand that they have the right to dictate how the money is used. So the cleanest, easiest thing to do is, if you have the opportunity, is to ask the donor, "Hey, just give it specifically to the library and do not mention the municipality," because it creates a lot of confusion after the fact. If a donor wants to earmark that money for a specific purpose or put a condition on it, they certainly can, and the library is obligated to follow those conditions, unless the conditions they put down are just patently like unsafe or incredibly illegal, like it's a safety issue. But if they put this is just for children's materials, this is just for staff recognition, then those are things that the library would have to follow. You're also going to want to find out and clarify with your attorney whether or not you'd have to use the Prudent Use of Institutional Funds Act to manage that money, which requires certain levels of reporting, or whether the family in donating that money, if it's a family foundation or something, if there's a certain amount of reporting that that foundation requires as a condition of that donation. So those are
Mhm.
all things that you're going to want to ask about if someone hands you a big pile of money, or even a small pile of money.
If you get one, we'll all be delighted for you.
Yes, absolutely. It is a great problem to have. Um, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Does anybody have any other questions, or did we miss any questions?
I don't see anything more in chat.
I, s-
If
I
you don't have
see
something in chat, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
I
Uh,
see I see that Becky put in the note for the survey. Please, please, please fill out the survey because it really helps us a lot. If there's other information you'd like to know about and you'd like to have a session on, put that in there too. We're always looking for topics that you need. Um,
Claire, there is a question on stipends to board members for meetings.
if funds cannot purchase food or board members for meetings, does that include stipends for meeting? No. So again, this is kind of a sticky area. The District Library Establishment Act provides that board members can be paid up to $30 per meeting. And so that's part of the statute, and that's your money. That's what you can earn. That's not part of that other amount. And if all of you get together and say, you know what, we vote that we're going to use our stipends to buy dinner, that's up to you because that's your money. Um, other other libraries, it's a little stickier. There are some instances where the library establishment law specifically says that you cannot receive compensation for being a board member. And so if your community is giving you compensation, that's kind of a problem. Some communities may give uh, uh, kind of money for things like parking or reimbursement for certain things. And like if you purchase paper or you purchase a notebook or whatever, they give you reimbursement, and that's fine. But as far as compensation for being a trustee, there are some instances where you're just can't receive it under statute. There's other instances where it's kind of not discussed one way or the other, and there's some municipalities that give it to their library boards. So it's kind of a little bit all over the place. But if you're given compensation, then that's your money. It's not, once you get it, it's your money. It's not the library's money. So you can use it for whatever you want to use it for. If you want to give end of the year awards to staff, can we do it if we budget for it and call it compensation? Um, I think part of that might depend on what you mean by awards. If you mean everybody is going to get them, then you probably can. If you're
Mhm.
talking in performance based where only some are getting them, then I'm not sure that that's okay. But that's a question I would ask your lawyer, because I know that you can give bonuses as compensation. So if you're looking at these performance awards as bonuses, like merit-based bonuses, then I would venture to say that if you have a written policy on how an employee qualifies for these performance awards, then maybe you could count it as compensation and do it that way. I would be leaning towards yes. I would still double check with your attorney, but you would want to make sure that you have a very solid policy on so that everybody has the opportunity to get one.
Mhm.
Um, you don't want to make it discretionary or subjective in any way. Does that board agreement on stipends for food need to be voted on? Yeah, I would do that. If you're going to take
Mhm.
everybody's compensation, you're going to want to make sure everybody votes on it because it's their personal money. You can't co-opt it unless everybody agrees that A, I'm willing to vote on this because some people may say, no, I just want to keep my money. But if everybody says, you know what, that's a great idea, let's vote on it, then yes, you can do that. That's because it's your money, right? Once it's paid out, it's your money. So what I would recommend is that you take it and then all of you write a check and say, or all of you throw money in and say, okay, this is for library. You can give it back, donate it back to the library with a condition that says this is for board meals. Bonus based on hours. Uh, you mean how many hours someone works? You can unmute if you want. Let me see. I can maybe unmute you. There you go.
Yeah. Based on the number of hours they worked on the year, can you give them a bonus based on that at the end of every year?
I would say you could, and you could use it as compensation, but you would want to make sure, again, that you have a policy laid out that's pretty clear as to what the criteria is for getting a bonus.
Okay. Thank you.
And you may also want to consider layers of bonuses, so that your part-time staff has an opportunity to also have something, even though it might be smaller than your full-time staff. Because one of the things you can get into with that is, are there some staff members that are favored over others, and so they're given bigger schedules and more hours, and you can get into the weeds with stuff like that. So you just want to kind of keep in mind unintended consequences when you're looking at things like that.
Our techie person does get more hours than the average, just because we need.
Right.
Yeah.
Society, a lot of us are not up to date.
Right, right. It's just you want to make sure it's equitable. You want to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to gain. But if you have people who are like, oh, I just can't work that many hours, then, if they're given the opportunity to work them and they just choose not to, then that's different. But if if only one person is ever offered extra hours and then gets an award for it, that's kind of questionable. Especially if you get into, well, it just so happens that the person who gets the award is one, racial religion person, and the person who doesn't get it is another one. Like, you can get into real weeds here that you don't intend to. So that's why you want to make really carefully sure that your program is, drawn out, and you have good policies and a good metric for determining who gets the award, who doesn't get the award. If you're not going to give everybody.
Okay.
Anybody else?
This is Eunice. I would like to ask two questions.
Sure.
Regarding board compensation. I think you said that we're a district library.
Mhm.
It's covered somewhere that there is a $30 per board member payment allowed?
Yeah, there's a $30 per meeting. So
Okay.
for every board meeting you attend, you can get $30. But it's then there's a limit. Like, I think it's limited at 12 meetings a year or something like that. Um, and there are some boards in the state that refuse it and don't do it, or they donate it all back to the library. And then there's others that do. I can give you uh, the statutory section where it says that.
Where does the money come from?
Oh, it would come from the library budget.
Oh, all right. Okay. That is something I've never heard of, and we don't take advantage of that. But related, the municipality that appointed me to the library board does pay me a monthly stipend, if you would, for every library board meeting that I attend and actively participate in.
Hmm. Okay.
Hmm.
Hang on one second. I think there are some municipalities that do that. I'm just double checking. I want to make sure that the statute doesn't say that the only money you're allowed to get is that $30.
Does anyone have other questions while Claire is checking on that? Mhm. Good point, Ruth. Ruth posted in chat that some jobs naturally allow employees to do
Mhm.
special things that get noticed while other jobs may not.
Right.
So yes, to consider the fairness of bonuses, that there's at least an opportunity for other staff to participate.
Yeah. And that can really create real dissension and affect morale. So that's something you really want to be careful about. Oh, come on.
Yeah, the Library of Michigan, we have staff who go out and do presentations at conferences and staff who don't.
Oh, here we go.
So that might not be something we would want to base a bonus on, because there are staff members who would just never do that as part of their duties.
Okay, so it says here, compensation shall not exceed $30 per board member per meeting. A board member shall not be compensated for attending more than 52 meetings per year. So it's 52 meetings. But it says a board may compensate board members. So that tells me that your municipality within their own laws may have the authority to compensate you separately from what the District Library Establishment Act says. So it is quite possible that you could get your municipal stipend and then also receive a stipend from the library board if the library board so wishes, and that's you. But I would definitely tell your municipality if you do get a stipend from the library board, because they may wish to adjust whatever you get now accordingly.
Is the municipality, in this case, a township, limited to the $30?
I don't think so, because
Okay.
this statute is couched in the board may give it to you from the library budget.
Okay,
So that has nothing to do with your municipal budget.
great, thank you.
So I would, but again, this gets sticky. Well, you're in a township, so that's a little different. But if you're in a
Well,
city, say, and your city largely manages the library money and is taking the board your stipend out of the library budget, then that could create an issue. But
no,
if
I'm a
it's
district.
separate,
I'm a
district, I
library.
apologize. Yeah,
Yeah.
district, you shouldn't have an issue.
And
But
one of the townships is within our district.
right,
Okay,
right.
okay,
That's
thank you.
different. But I know for some, I think it's city PA 164, some city libraries under PA 164 are just statutorily prohibited from receiving a stipend.
Great, thank you.
That's nice that municipality does it.
Well, we're at close to the end of our time. Any last questions? Nobody? Well, again, I'd like to reiterate for Claire and I, feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you might have. That's what we're here for. So we're happy to provide what assistance we can. Sometimes our assistance is, well, that's a really darn good question. You should call an attorney. But we'll do our best to be as helpful as we can.
Thank you very much for attending. We really appreciate it. And thanks again for being board members.
Daniel does have a quick question about
Okay.
other meetings.
As a board member, there are other, I think that if you're on committees, for your board, it says you can get up to 52 a year. I would say that as long as the board agrees, because the board have to vote on this, I would say that's probably within that. As long as it's capped at 52 a year, you can't get any more than 52 a year.
But yeah, official meetings on the calendar, I would consider that good.
Yeah. but going to your municipal board meeting, I don't think would be covered. But going to,
Mhm.
unless you're required to be there, unless like you're presenting. But if you're going to, your library finance meeting and stuff, I would say that would be included.
All righty, everyone have a good afternoon. Hopefully you'll have good weather and you'll all have a lovely holiday
Yeah.
weekend.
Have fun.